Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amor de Soi Wellness. And Donovan Jensen is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are talking about people pleasing. Yes. So, Donovan, I'm curious, what are your initial thoughts when it comes to people pleasing?
Well, this particular topic is something that I have gotten a good amount of mileage out of for myself,
Yeah.
which is, I just naturally, I guess, have tended towards people pleasing in a way that often has come at some sacrifice to myself
Mm-hmm.
and in times that it may not have even been necessary. So maybe we can unpack that a bit more as we go, but basically that's been my experience. And when it's not useful, right, is when I am sacrificing things that are important to me or don't need to be sacrificed for other people. And I think there's probably some nuance around times where making sacrifices for others is useful, but in my mind, the idea of sort of people pleasing is when you are off sort of the useful end of that spectrum.
Yeah. That's kind of what I associate with people pleasing. It has sort of a negative connotation, but I kind of see it as like occurring on a spectrum. It's when you get to the point where it's causing you harm or detriment, then that's where it becomes a real problem that we should look at and address. Although, I don't think there's anything wrong with, wanting to have people be happy, essentially. I mean, it would be weird to just be someone who actively is trying to make people unhappy or anything to that extreme. But when I think of people pleasing, I think it's going beyond like overexerting yourself, kind of taking your own self care and self compassion off the table in sake of this other person. So, which doesn't always have to be the case. And I, similarly to you, have had a lot of experience with this, and I think I've become more aware and present, have set clear boundaries, which I think is like the starting point of, setting yourself up for not putting yourself in the dirt, essentially, if that makes sense. Yeah, boundaries.
Yeah, I think that is a good starting point and sort of one of the things that you have to work on to get over this. I think it's also in the same sort of bucket as conflict avoidance, right? Where like a
Yeah.
lot of the times it's sort of this tension between like, oh, here's this thing that I need, but I don't want to upset this other person. And actually going along with that, there have been a number of times personally, and I've seen with others where they're doing something that I would call people pleasing, where it's like I'm acting in a certain way because I think it's what's going to make this other person happy or feel better or whatever else, when it may not even be mapped on to the reality, right? Like you may be avoiding bringing up certain needs or things or whatever else, thinking that it would be easier or nicer or better for the other person when it's actually not. But I think you're right, like setting boundaries and like preparing yourself or getting practice with having conflict. And when I say conflict, like I think some people might think of that as more aggressive than really what I mean, but it just means anytime that there could be any tension whatsoever. I think that's another piece to sort of start working on to unravel some of these tendencies.
Yeah. No, I think you brought up a really good point about the people pleasing. The word that came to my mind was, in a way, it can be inauthentic, of, kind of giving your own needs a break, or just not really expressing like what's like avoiding conflict. Like, for example, if your partner like never puts the toilet seat down, just drives you crazy, but you never say anything, you just silently complain about it to yourself and just have this inner resentment, but on the outside you like act like it's totally fine, not an issue, but underneath it's like you have this hidden resentment, and then that like stews into other things and could maybe build into other bigger conflicts. and not wanting to interact with a conflict can really create damage to that relationship potentially, because it's like you're not sharing. I mean, you have to pick your battles. It's like, okay, maybe it's on you to let it go. If it bothers you, you just put the seat down. Or if it's like something that really is like, hey, let's create partnership, and like, hey, I know you're not going to remember to do it all the time, but maybe let's try to do it a little bit more or something to that effect.
Yeah, I mean, it bleeds into a couple other things, which is like one point is it's not really fair for you to have expectations of people that you haven't communicated in a way, right? And doing this sort of people pleasing pattern can get you into loops where you are like very passive aggressive, or are basically the bottom line is like you're not being assertive enough or communicating well enough to display some of the things that you need. Every situation is different. There are, I'm sure, situations where people like have tried to communicate it and then just sort of give up and
Right.
like
Let it go.
revert to people pleasing. But I think that's a very common pattern for people who do people pleasing a lot, is they just sort of don't have good tools. At least this resonates for me. Like, I didn't have good tools for communicating some of those things, and relationships in my past, like when I was younger, many of them did not give me the space to sort of open up a dialogue and a conversation and sort of make progress. So I eventually just had sort of a baseline pattern of like, well, I'll just deal with it because I don't want to deal with the other half of it. I'd be curious if you had an experience like that, or what your thoughts are on sort of like historically, because I think that's how I got into it, is it was sort of a learned pattern from earlier interactions.
Yeah, no, I think that is a big part of it. And I've had similar experiences where, I didn't feel like, even if I tried to communicate, or maybe I didn't really make the effort to, or and I didn't know how to communicate effectively. So it was just like two people not communicating effectively, leading to all this conflict, or not really being able to like fully express myself and be more authentic of what I'm needing. What comes to my mind with people pleasing is sort of, I go back to when I was in school, and you want to get good grades, and I feel like I did it for my parents rather than myself. and like looking back now, I'm at where I was and where I am now. I feel like, okay, I take more time to evaluate whether or not I'm doing this for myself and for my own happiness, or my own self-growth or self-worth, or whatever that might be, versus like someone else. I think that's another piece of it that I wanted to add.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense, because if you're doing it something like that explicitly for someone else, but it's a choice that doesn't really impact them. I mean, it does, but it doesn't, right? Like, it's your choice of career and education and all those sorts of things. That, I think, fits squarely within some of the things that are worth revisiting, like something actually thinking about what you want and what's genuine and authentic, like you were saying. I would be curious to open up a little bit how you think about the dividing line between, like, a case like that for me is more clear, right? It's like, if you're doing it for your parents, something you don't care about, it's your own career, that's squarely in that camp. But I'd be curious how you think about sort of the distinction around sacrificing things for others in a way that is actually genuine and useful, right? Like, I don't know, like somebody who has a job and works and is barely covering their rent, but still sends home a couple $100 to their parents to help them out, versus sort of what we talked about, which is squarely like, you pick your career, but if you're doing it for your parents, then that's like some variant of people pleasing.
Yeah, that first scenario is a little tricky, because it's like you love your parents and you want to support them, but if you're struggling yourself, it's like, what do you what do you do in that it's like, I don't even know what I would do in that scenario of like, ask for I don't know exactly. I'm kind of at a loss with that. That's a difficult situation to be in for any person. So that one I think is a little bit of a gray area. But when I think of people pleasing, I'm like, yeah, I'm kind of at a loss with
Let me
that
try.
scenario. I'm like, I don't
Let me
know
try a
what I
different
would-
version of the
Okay.
question, and we'll
Yeah.
see if that unlocks something. So, what is a scenario that you think would be appropriate for you to sacrifice something for someone else that's not people pleasing?
I feel like that scenario was not quite exactly people pleasing. It was like coming from a place of like, you love your parents, you want to support them. But again, I don't know what's going on in that person's brain of, so a scenario where it wouldn't be people pleasing. I think that was a scenario, but I'm trying to think of like other scenarios of people pleasing where it's like clearly something that you're sacrificing that is causing you detriment, but that scenario is causing you detriment. So this is a really difficult topic. really, really, maybe I'm trying to people please right in this moment. I'm just trying to like think of something more profound to say than stumbling over my words. And I think it also comes to like preservation. Speaking of that, it comes to like self-preservation of like looking good and staying in the looking good aspect versus just like not wanting to look weak or not feeling like, oh, your needs matter or like that's that important. Also, it comes to like a self-worth type of issue, like, oh, my needs aren't as important as this other person's needs. And I'm trying to think of another scenario that would exemplify that. But I'm drawing a blank.
I'll buy you a little bit more time.
Okay.
So as you were talking about that, I sort of started thinking in terms of like the relationship that you have with the, we'll call it a sacrifice, but I guess like cost, right? And I think the effects of the cost you're paying make a big difference in terms of whether it's people pleasing or something that's actually genuinely useful, right? So, you know, if it's something like, we'll go back to that original scenario of like, you're barely making it, but you're sending home money.
Right.
If that is from a place of like, if your relationship with that is sort of, you genuinely, authentically are like, hey, you know what? Like, I'm not going to go out to eat ever. I'm just going to have like the bare minimum of food, always eat from the grocery store, cook at home type of deal. And I am 100% okay with doing that so that my parents can make their rent or their mortgage or whatever else. I think that sort of relationship is one that's more authentic, right? But if you have one that's more like, well, I guess I have to do this because they raised me and it seems like they need it and I don't really want to. I would rather have this other thing. And in this example, it kind of makes you sound selfish. But, you know, like if the relationship is more pained around like something like a sense of either obligation or like something more external, right? You feel some stronger external pull that has you do this. It falls, in my mind, closer to the bucket of people pleasing. Now, it might be something like I just said, like you might think obligation is something separate from people pleasing, and that's totally fine because I think we could probably play in the margins there a little bit. But overall, I think that's as you were sort of like trying to unpack it, what became more clear to me is like the interaction and the relationship that you have with it is pretty important because in my experience, when I've done things that I would consider people pleasing, my relationship with those sacrifices is not good at all. It's me being like, I don't really want to do this, but I guess I have to, as opposed to like, I'm genuinely okay with this. And while it's like putting me backward in some way, it is actually helping another person that I care about a lot. And I think that last part is important too, because there have also been times where I'm like, I'm okay with this and it's really helping this other person. But if I was to get a third party to look at it, they'd be like, no, you're just kind of like hindering yourself to no benefit of the other person. So I think it's a combination of those two factors.
Yeah, I think you teased it out really well with the, you know, how do you feel about the scenario? If it's like really not that big of a deal, then, and you want to help out that person, even though it might set you back a little, but you really want to make that difference, then okay. It actually made me think of this, the story I read on, on Reddit. There's the, like, am I the asshole? Like the forums that I get sucked into. And there was this one situation where the son had moved in with the father for like school. And the father said he would be able to stay there for free while he went to school. But then over the summer, he had a full-time job. So he's still living there, but he was paying rent in the summer to support his father and his stepmother and her children and all that. But then like come school is about to start again, so he's going to have to quit the full-time job to go back to school. The father tells him, oh, actually, we're really struggling financially right now, and I don't want you to go back to school. You could just do it later. I want you to keep working that full-time job and support us, continue to support us, because we're really struggling right now. And so the person in the original poster, the OP, was saying like, am I the asshole for refusing to do that? And I think the majority of the commenters were like, no, it's like, one, he was actually paying like a ridiculous amount for rent when his father said he would be able to not have to pay rent. But two, it's like that, like him sacrificing his education for his father is one thing, but then for like his stepmother and the children that he like barely had any relationship with or barely even knew was like another thing that just didn't sit right with him, and it didn't sit right with me. So I think if he did cave and just like gave up his education to support his family, or his father and his father's family, then that would have been too big of a sacrifice, and that would have been a people pleasing type of scenario. But I think he stood his ground, he stood his boundary, and decided to find a way to move out and not be in that difficult situation anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of sort of why the relationship with whatever the task or sacrifice is matters a lot, because I also think there could have been, not based on what you told me his thoughts and feelings were, but a hypothetical situation where they were different thoughts and feelings, where it would have been an authentic choice to stay and try to help and defer schooling and stuff. But I think you're right. Like doing that surely out of sort of like obligation or pressure externally would fall into the bucket of people pleasing, and would have been something that I think like the people pleasing, when you're doing that, it causes inherently some sort of negative tension, right? Where actual like genuine sacrifices that you're okay with don't. They might cause some hardship, but not tension in the choice that you've made itself. So yeah, no, I think that's a really good example of just sort of the different factors, or how like one choice easily could or could not be an instance of people pleasing.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to touch on, which just like popped into my mind about people pleasing, is that I think there's actually a strong association with, like, when I see the trend of people pleasing in my patients, I notice, I mean, maybe it's the fact that I work with a lot of anxiety patients, but that's what I specialize in. But I think that's a common trait with people with anxiety, is like they're so anxious of disappointing or whoever they're trying to please, that they make those bigger sacrifices, and in the sake of like avoiding conflict, avoiding like that situation.
Here's following up on that. We've been talking a lot about sort of bigger instances or more important choices or things that are people pleasing. But I've also seen, and personally, I this is a big struggle for me, like small instances of people pleasing and small things, like, and it still fits in the bucket of conflict avoidance, but there have been a great number of times that I like don't ask for something because I feel like I'm inconveniencing or putting out someone else.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess maybe it's not people pleasing, but in a reverse sense of it, right? It's like not adding obligations or work
Right.
or effort to someone else. And that's another thing that like I've seen or had to work on in the past, where like sometimes it's around me thinking, oh, if I ask for this thing, I'm going to put a huge burden on someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, again, if you take this like third party perspective, it's really not a big ask, or it's part of their job, or it's included in the thing that you're already paying for, or whatever else, right? I'd just be curious if you've had experience with that, or seen that, or your thoughts in that realm on things that are sort of smaller scale, but it's sort of the opposite. It's not necessarily,
Right.
oh, I'm doing something to make this person's life easier, as much as it is I'm not doing something to so that I don't add to this person's like difficulties or things they need to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tricky one too, because I definitely have been in that scenario personally. And I was just thinking of like recently when my husband was just really stressed out with just like life and everything going on. I kind of, decided to not share like some of the things going on with me because I didn't want to like stress or overwhelm him when he had all this going on. But, at the same time, when things calmed down for him, I kind of just like put it to the side temporarily. It wasn't like a permanent, like, oh, all my emotional needs and my needs for emotional support are not important. It's like, okay, now is not a good time. I'll do it maybe a week later, kind of a thing. Uh, but I think that's different if I just kept like putting it off, and never actually expressing like, hey, this is what's going on with me. But you can also still be compassionate about like what that other person's dealing with and say, oh, I know you have a lot going on. I'm really struggling too right now. I don't know if you have the emotional space or capacity to be here for me, but if you do, then I'm happy to share what's going on. But like leaving that door open, and maybe they can say, no, I have way too much going on. I can't deal with this right now. But maybe later. So it opens the window versus just like not communicating at all, like what those needs might be, or if you're struggling with something yourself. That's kind of what came to my mind.
Yeah, I think in the same realm, it's just not realistic to well, it is realistic, but it's not like useful to constantly defer your needs to make other people's lives
Right.
easier. In the same
Easier.
way, like the situation you described, like it makes sense to put that off potentially for a week or something. And
Mm-hmm.
like you said, if it becomes a pattern where you continually putting it off,
Mm-hmm.
then you're going to suffer in a way that you don't necessarily have to, right? I mean, I've seen the pattern. I've been in the pattern of deferring things like that for an extended period of time
Mm-hmm.
because of the initial sort of scenario. Hey, this isn't a good time for this specific thing. But
Right.
then later carrying that into like, oh, it's still not a good time, still not a good time.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the scenario has changed and it has become a better
Right.
time because it's
Right.
like, well, I already dealt with it for a week. I probably just
Yeah.
deal with it now. Like, um, and I think it's like a slippery slope where you can quickly end up with a huge plate of things that have been deferred,
Mm-hmm.
or a huge set of tasks, or a huge whatever, right? Like you just end up with all of these things, and it's like the death by a thousand cuts, right? Like that
Right.
eventually it all builds up to some more serious problems, or you not getting the things you need, or in some scenarios you being taken advantage of because you're not asserting sort of your needs, like it's in a way that's unfair to you.
Mm-hmm.
But I think from what I've seen, it often starts with sort of these small pieces. And I think the example you gave, the sort of tool set you gave of opening the conversation around the expectations, or starting towards that path, whether or not it's resolved immediately, at least gets the things, like at least get your needs in the air, and
Mm-hmm.
then the specific timing or the details or whatever else can be worked out.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. The other thing that came to my mind, because I do want to have people have some sort of walk away if they find themselves being a people pleaser. The other thing that came to my mind was like the inability to say no, and recognizing like just saying yes to everything and setting that boundary. So I think it's like if you start to get overwhelmed or you're taking on too much, it's just like take a step back and realize that it's not selfish to take care of yourself if you're really run down, you're burnt out, and you can't really be as effective with helping people if you're constantly saying yes to everything and just run down all the time. So setting those boundaries, which is not always easy, saying no is like building a muscle for some people. That's like once you do it, it's not as bad. It gets easier. And that's something I think I've had to learn or communicate when I just don't feel like. There also been scenarios when I've been, given a task or something that I don't feel like I know how to handle. And that's always a stressful situation, but you just like fake pretend that you can figure it out. But in reality, you don't really know what you're going to do. That's a scenario where you want to be able to communicate and get the help you need if you're not fully sure what you're supposed to be doing too.
Yeah, this is sort of a tangent, but you just activated something in my mind, which is I feel like whenever people talk about saying no, not whenever, but often when people talk about saying no, there's this sentiment of like you should feel good saying no about anything, and you don't have to explain yourself at all. And I understand the sentiment to a degree because there are people who feel guilty saying no to anyone for anything and then over explain the reason and just like go on and on and on. And, the idea is like, it's your time. You get to choose how to spend it.
Right.
But that sentiment of like, you just say no to people and you don't have to explain yourself is one that is heavily colored by context. Like,
I think context matters.
Because I've just seen some people take it and run with it and say, and say no to things like, it's like, I don't know, your mom's birthday and you don't want to go and you're just like, I'm not coming, and you have a good relationship other than that. Like, if you don't explain at least to some degree, like, hey, I'm not feeling good, I don't want to come to this, like some little piece of information around what's going on. Assuming the rest of the relationship is like good and healthy, is actually useful, right? Like communicating things. Now, I think the advice is supposed to be targeted more for like cold calls or like random door-to-door stuff or things like that. But even in work settings, right? Like even in work settings, if your boss comes and asks you for something, just saying no by itself is probably less useful than saying like, no, I have too much on my plate right now, or no, I need help, prioritizing this against all these other things or whatever else, right? So it's not directly what you were talking about, but it just touched on a nerve in my brain around this idea of like, you should be able to say no. The follow-up that I hear all the time is like, with no explanation, you just do whatever, like just say no and you don't have to justify it. And it's like, you don't always have to justify it, but you should be very cognizant of the relationship and the situation, because sometimes even a couple small details will help a lot as far as keeping communication open, as opposed to people getting like confused and frustrated because you're just canceling things without any information.
Any explanation. Yeah, I think context really matters, and I think it also helps kind of, I mean, in an opposite way, avoid a conflict by like, if you just say no and then don't explain yourself, that could create a conflict. And I mean, this is avoiding conflict in a healthier way, I guess, in that, it's just like people are understanding a lot of the times. And if your boss comes and tells you like, hey, can you do this thing? If you give them context of like, oh, actually, this other boss told me to do XYZ and this is gonna like consume my life for a while, so I don't have any capacity to handle this thing. But if you want to talk to the other boss and figure out what's the bigger priority, be my guest, or something to that effect. So it's clear. I appreciate when someone, if I don't expect everyone to say yes to me all the time. If they say no, I mean, I feel better when they give me a little context. Otherwise, I feel like they come off as a asshole. It's just like it helps. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe the nuance is in sort of the details too, right? Like if I ask someone like, I don't know, hey, do you want to go rafting over the weekend or something? And somebody just says no, like that will not feel awesome.
Yeah.
But if they say no, I have other plans, totally
Right.
fine.
Oh,
Like
yeah,
100% feels fine and normal.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
also if they say, no, my grandma is coming into town and she has like health problems and we have to go to the doctor and we have to do this and this and this and that and this and this and that. Totally fine. Like totally fine to explain at that level. But I think you don't, that's sort of like the level of like, you don't need to justify it in terms of you don't have to tell me
the whole
all the
scenario.
details of exactly what's going on. And I think that is actually really common where like when people want to or need to say no to something,
Right.
they really expand a lot and try to like really justify the reason why. And I think maybe that's why it's so common. You hear people saying like you don't have to justify yourself. But I think that's sort of the nuance, right? Between like just saying no and nothing else, just saying no with sort of some context, and just saying no in a way that like it almost feels like you're trying to convince the other person that it's okay for you to say no. That's the one where it's like, okay, you don't have to do that.
Right.
So I just really, I don't know. It's like one thing that's bothered me for a long time. And so this is the outlet. This is the day that it's coming out.
This is the time to get it out.
Yeah.
And I think if we were to take that same scenario with like explaining why you can't go rafting because your grandma's coming into town, I would think like a way a people pleaser might approach that would be like, oh, I don't know if I can make it. I'll let you know. I'll like not saying giving a firm no or explaining that the grandma's coming into town, just being like, yeah, I'll do my best to make it. I'll like, yeah, I'm gonna really try and make, and then just like ghost them or something to that effect would feel less good versus I'd rather just have the straight up no, like I got other plans, simple, easy, and that's okay. And sometimes those other plans could be like, I have like I've been like working every single day and I need a day to like hang out in my bed and watch TV. That could be the plan, but you don't have to explain that. You just have plans and it's that can be your plan.
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a really good example of people pleasing, right? Where it's like you can respond in a way that what you think you're doing is saving the other person emotionally, right? Like, oh, I'll try my best to make it, but I'm not sure if I can. When you already know you don't want to, like you already know you're not going to, either you don't want to, you have another conflict, whatever. You already know it's not going to happen. But you do sort of this like inauthentic, like, oh, I'll do my best. It sounds so fun. I would love to go, but just like plans are a little tight and maybe we'll squeeze it in. Like, that's a really good example of it. And what it does and where the problem lies is twofold, where one, you're doing something that's not authentic. So it takes an extra stretch to sort of like work your way into saying something like that.
Yeah.
And the other piece is you're actually not saving the person anything emotionally.
Right.
In fact, it's worse because, I on the receiving end, I mean, I guess there maybe is a couple people who aren't like this, but the vast majority of people would much rather just know, like, even if somebody said like, no, I don't feel like doing that, or like, no, that doesn't seem like an activity I'm interested in.
Yeah.
Cool. I would much rather have that than the other piece, because then I've learned something about you that's useful. Like it's not something that you want to do. Like you don't like that. Okay, great. It doesn't hurt my feelings. Like for some people who are less emotionally mature, it might, right? They might be like, oh, but I really wanted you to come and I think it'd be so fun. Like, okay, well, that's and maybe that's part of how this pattern develops, is being around people like that who get offended or hurt from things like that. But in general, in the nicest ideal case where people are more emotionally mature, that's not something that's going to cause someone any anguish. And if it does, it's not your responsibility to baby them around it.
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. And speaking of that scenario, and it doesn't help. Like if you're like, oh yeah, I totally want to do it, but you're deathly afraid of rafting or something to that effect. It's like if you express like you're interested, but in reality you're not really, then they might invite you again. So it just serves you both better if you just are clear with the no, I'm just not into that kind of thing, and then leave it at that.
That is what the example we just sort of talked about is one of the most dangerous. Ooh, it's so scary. One of the least useful sorts of people pleasing, where it's like you're doing something that feels inauthentic to yourself, or you're putting yourself out in some way, and you're pretending in your head that you're making the other person's life easier or better in some way, and it's not actually doing that.
Right.
So what you end up with effectively is you are doing less good, and the person that you're trying to like act in a particular way for is also doing less good. And being stuck in those patterns, especially if it escalates to things that are actually important, can really cause a lot of harm all around for something that it is how do I put it? The conflict you're avoiding, or the potential conflict you're avoiding, is nowhere near as bad as sort of the after effects of everything else that is being caused by the people pleasing behaviors.
Yeah. Actually, that made me think of, I remembered what I was going to say earlier was that, the other scenario, I think of like people doing like small white lies to help a person's like, oh, well, I don't want to hurt their feelings by telling them that thing. And in reality, like whenever a significant other does that, or even a family member or friend does that to me, I get so livid because I'd rather be upset from that thing. I don't want you to spare my feelings. I'd rather have you tell me honestly, like what the situation is, because you're breaking the trust and that's hurting the relationship. And then it's like, oh, if you are lying about this little thing, how do I know you're not lying about big things? So I think that's also important to touch on.
Yeah, I think people get scared because they think they're going to hurt people's feelings a lot.
Yeah.
And they think either, I say this in an inauthentic way, white lie kind of way, or I say it in this like very hurtful way. And the reality is often there's a third path. Like there's a more nuanced way to communicate certain things that is less hurtful and more useful. Right. And I think a lot of people don't have the tool set, or at least me developing the tool set has allowed me to do a lot less people pleasing, because I feel comfortable verbally navigating some of those pieces. So, if somebody asks me, I do the music stuff, right? So people ask me about songs all the time, or certain like things that they've written. And there is a line between like, a lot of them are beginners. So a lot of the stuff that they're sending me is not good, but there is a way that you can empower the person and still show that you care for them as a person, that you don't think they suck overall, even if there are certain aspects that they need to work on.
Right.
So developing your communication skills and being sort of accepting and empowering, but still firm on certain things can help a lot for navigating some of those trickier situations where you feel like you might need to lie. Right. It's not useful to tell someone if you can see clear gaps that like, oh, you're doing great. This is awesome. This is amazing.
Yeah.
But typically in any sort of scenario like that, you can usually highlight things that are going well. And if you can't, you can still at least reaffirm that you believe in the person, or see positive traits or whatever else, right? Like,
totally.
Hey, thanks for sharing this thing that you wrote with me. I appreciate that you trust me to look over this. I do have some feedback on it. The only reason that I'm going to give it to you is because I think there are things that could be better. And not because I think that you suck, but just because I think there are places in your skill that we can improve. I'm going to give you those. I don't mean it to be like an attack on you or your skill set or anything like that. Let me tell you what I think, and then we can sort of discuss some of the details. Like, that's an example of maybe an over formalized way of like opening up some of these conversations so that you make sure that there's a lot of space for like, I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm not trying to be mean.
Right.
I do know something about this topic, or I do see some gaps, or I do have ideas, and then we can talk about it. Not like, I know for sure that this sucks. Let me tell you why it sucks, and then we're done. And I think that's kind of common, at least in terms of people don't have the tool set to, or don't feel comfortable kind of like playing in the details and the nuances between,
Right.
and then they end up in that sort of like white lie, people pleasing side of things.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really valid and important point, because it doesn't serve, like if you were to white lie and be like, oh, this is fantastic, it doesn't serve you, it doesn't serve them, and they're not going to work as hard or know what they need to do to get better and actually be good. And I think that's like maybe a common scenario with like a mentor mentee type of situation where, yeah, there can be mentors that are like super harsh and like mean about it, of like, you will never make it in this industry kind of a thing,
Yep.
versus like, hey, there's room for improvement, and if you work hard, you know, there's ways we can get better. And so giving them some more compassion and space, but also being real with them and being like, this isn't that good. And that's okay. That's exactly where most beginners are typically. Yeah.
Another thing specifically in those types of relationships is that if you are giving someone feedback, obviously in some cases you don't know the path to improvement, but
Right.
in general, it's going to be far more useful when you can actually point out like, okay, I'll go back to the writing example, like the structure of the sentences here are very long. Like if you can find ways to split your sentences out to be shorter, it will flow more smoothly, right? If you're able to give feedback with sort of a way to actually improve the thing, especially if you're like someone's boss, it's crazy to like the both of these paths are useless, which are saying they're doing good when they're not, and just telling them they suck. Like I heard
Right.
recently, somebody at their job, like a new manager came in who wants to like turn everything around and make everything productive.
Yeah.
All he's doing is telling people like, you're not done with this, you should already be done with this. And that's not helpful at all. It doesn't do
That's
anything.
helpful, yeah. Right.
So I think, you know, in the same vein, people have those same sort of thoughts, but are on a people pleasing path and are like, you're doing a really good job. You're doing the best you can. And they're not finishing fast enough or whatever, as fast as you think they should. Whereas really the useful thing to do is like, I know you're doing your best. You're not getting it done fast enough. What can we do to help you speed that up? Like what things can we change to be more efficient? And that's where you'll actually get mileage out of some of these conversations and interactions.
Yeah. Yeah, totally agree with that situation. All right. Well, I think we covered this topic pretty well. Do you have any other final thoughts?
The only last thing is just sort of, you know, this is people pleasing is a pattern or habit that can seem really benign, but can actually cause all sorts of problems. And even if it's just in small cases, like, yeah, it might not be ruining your life, but it might be really limiting the quality of your life in a lot of different and small ways. So if you can start working on it and finding ways to like be more assertive, navigate through some of these conflicts, things like that, I think most people will find that it's not nearly as painful, the small conflicts that do come up, and the things that you actually get on both ends are far more valuable.
Absolutely. Agree with that completely. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in this week. We appreciate you. And if you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and do all the things that help spread happiness in the world. We will see you next time.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please take a second to subscribe, as it really helps out a lot. If you're looking for more content, there's all sorts of information over at howtohappy.com. And if you want something a little bit more condensed and concise, I've also written the book Mindscaping, which is essentially a framework for optimizing happiness. So we'll have the link there as well. And that's all I've got. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.